My name is Nathan Pierce, and I want to tell you about the day I stood at the edge of a gravel road and watched a bulldozer finish off the last thing my father ever built with his own hands. I got the call from a neighbor, an older man named Ed, who still lived up past the tree line. He didn't waste words. He just said, "Nathan, they're tearing down your dad's cabin. You need to get out here." By the time I pulled up, half the roof was already gone. A yellow excavator was parked in the yard like it belonged there, and a man in an orange vest was zip-tying a notice to the fence post like it was an afterthought. I grabbed it before he could stop me. Code violation. Unpermitted structure. Ordered by the Homeowners Association. There was no court order, no sheriff, no warning that I'd ever seen, just a piece of paper and a machine that didn't care whose memory it was crushing. I stood there in the dust asking myself the only question that mattered. How does an HOA get the authority to destroy something it never had any claim over in the first place? I'm 46 years old. I sell industrial equipment for a living. And until that morning, I would have told you I had a pretty settled life. Divorced, no kids, a house in town that never felt like much more than a place to sleep. The cabin was different. My father, Harold Pierce, built it himself back in the late 1970s. Board by board, on 5 acres at the edge of what was then just open country. There was no HOA out there when he poured the foundation. There wasn't even a paved road. He used to tell me the property line ran along an old fence row that predated half the county's maps, and that the land had never been part of any development deal. He'd bought it straight from a farmer who wanted out of the business. Dad passed 2 years ago. The cabin came to me, and it became the one place I could go where his voice still felt close. I fixed the porch steps he never got around to. I kept his tools in the shed exactly where he left them. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that somewhere along the way, a subdivision had grown up around that land and an HOA had started acting like it owned every acre inside its lines, including ours. The woman standing by the excavator introduced herself before I even asked. Carol Whitfield, president of the Meadowbrook Ridge Homeowners Association. She had the kind of calm that comes from never once being told no. "Mr. Pierce," she said, like she'd been expecting me. "I understand this is upsetting, but this structure has been in violation for months. We sent notices." "To where?" I said. "I never got anything." "To the property address on file." She said it flat, like that settled it. "Our records show this parcel is part of Meadowbrook Ridge, and any structure within the association's boundaries has to meet our building code. This one never did. No permit on file, no inspection, nothing." I told her the cabin was built in 1978, years before Meadowbrook Ridge existed as anything but a name on a developer's brochure. She didn't blink. "The covenant applies retroactively to any parcel within the mapped district," she said. "That's standard language. I didn't write the rules, Mr. Pierce. I just enforce them." I asked to see the notice. She said Roger Bass, the HOA's attorney, handled all official correspondence, and I could request copies through him. I asked who authorized the demolition. What board vote? What date? She said it was handled internally, and that details like that weren't something she owed me on the spot, standing in a driveway with a crew waiting to finish the job. That was the first thing that didn't sit right. Not the demolition itself. That was already a gut punch I hadn't caught my breath from yet. But the way she talked about authority like it was a fact of nature, instead of something she'd have to prove. I looked past her at what was left of the cabin. The porch Dad and I rebuilt together the summer before he died was already gone. The shed with his tools was untouched, for now, only because the crew hadn't gotten to it. "I want the paperwork," I told her. "All of it. The original notice, the board vote, the covenant language you're using to claim this parcel. Today, not through some lawyer next week." She smiled the kind of smile that isn't really a smile. "I'll have Roger follow up with you." Then she turned and walked back toward her car, leaving me standing in what used to be my father's yard with a stack of splintered lumber and a name, Meadowbrook Ridge, that I was about to spend a long time learning the real history of. Behind her, the foreman on the excavator throttled the engine back up, like he'd just been waiting for the conversation to end so he could get back to work. I put my hand up and told him to stop. He looked at Whitfield, not me, waiting for a nod before he'd cut the engine. That told me everything about who was really running this. Not the county, not a judge, not anybody with a badge. A woman with a clipboard and a crew that answered to her. Ed, the neighbor who'd called me, came down from his porch once Whitfield's car pulled out of the driveway. He'd lived on the ridge longer than the HOA had existed, And he had that look people get when they've watched something happen and can't quite believe nobody stopped it. "They rolled in here at 8 this morning," he said. "No cops, no county truck, nothing. Just that crew and her. I tried to tell them your dad built that place before any of this was here, but they didn't want to hear it." I asked him if he'd ever gotten a notice like the one zip-tied to my fence post. He shook his head. Said the HOA mostly left him alone because his place sat closer to the main road, inside what everybody assumed was the real boundary. That word, assumed, was going to matter more than either of us knew that morning. I called the number listed for Roger Bass right there in the driveway, got a voicemail with an office greeting so smooth it sounded recorded specifically for days like this. I left my name, my number, and told him I wanted every document tied to this demolition by the end of the week. Then I stood there a while longer, looking at what was left of the porch steps, running my hand along a rail my father had sanded smooth 30 years before. An HOA in this county had a name. Whatever Meadowbrook Ridge thought it had the right to do, I intended to find out exactly where that right actually started and stopped. Because standing in that driveway, watching a crew pack up their equipment like they'd just finished a routine job, I didn't know yet that the mapped district Whitfield kept repeating was about to become the entire case. Nobody, it turned out, had actually looked at that map in a very long time. Roger Bass called me back 3 days later, and it was clear from the first sentence that his job wasn't to help me, it was to manage me. "Mr. Pierce, I want to be up front," he said. "The association is within its rights to enforce architectural and code standards on any property within its recorded covenant boundary. I can send you the general covenant document, but board deliberations and internal notices are typically confidential." "I'm not asking for board gossip," I said. "I'm asking for the notice you claim you sent me, and whatever map shows my father's land inside your boundary." He said he'd look into what could be shared. 2 weeks passed. Nothing came. In the meantime, I went through every box of my father's paperwork I had stored in my garage. Most of it was what you'd expect. Old tax records, receipts for lumber, a folder of hand-drawn sketches he'd made before he ever poured the foundation. But near the bottom of one box, I found the original deed, notarized in 1978, describing the parcel boundary by metes and bounds, tied to an old fence row and a creek bed, rather than any subdivision plat. There was no mention of Meadowbrook Ridge. There couldn't have been. The deed predated it by almost a decade. That didn't surprise me. Whitfield had already claimed the covenant applied retroactively. What did surprise me was a small note in my father's own handwriting, tucked in the same folder, dated some 15 years back. "County resurveyed the ridgeline. Parcel confirmed outside development boundary per clerk's letter." I read that line 4 or 5 times. My father had known, or at least suspected, that his land sat outside whatever boundary the HOA was drawing around itself. And he'd never mentioned it to me, maybe because in his lifetime it never came up as a problem worth raising. I called the county recorder's office the next morning, hoping to track down whatever letter he was referencing. The woman on the phone was polite but unhelpful over the phone. She said records that old would need to be pulled in person, and that whoever handled resurveys back then had likely retired years ago. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the deed, my father's note, and a stack of Meadowbrook Ridge's glossy HOA newsletters I'd found stuffed in an old mailbox at the cabin, never opened. On the back page of one, there was a simple map of the association's boundary. I traced the ridgeline with my finger. The cabin's location, based on the old deed's description, sat right at the edge of it. Maybe on it, maybe just outside it. Close enough that a careless line on a photocopied map could put it on either side, depending on who drew it and when. For the first time since the bulldozer showed up, I let myself think past the anger and toward something more useful. If my father was right, and that resurvey really had confirmed the parcel sat outside their line, then Meadowbrook Ridge hadn't just been heavy-handed. They'd torn down a building they never had one shred of legal standing over. I mentioned all of it to my sister Karen on the phone that weekend. She'd never been as attached to the cabin as I was. She'd moved out of state years ago and visited maybe twice since Dad passed, but she still went quiet when I told her it was gone. "He built that place with his own hands," she said, "and they just knocked it down because a spreadsheet says it's theirs?" That was the plain version of it, and hearing her say it out loud made something in me settle into place. This wasn't really about property lines anymore, not entirely. It was about whether an organization with no legal authority over a piece of land could simply decide it did, and act on that decision with a machine before anyone could stop them. A week after finding my father's note, an envelope arrived from the Meadowbrook Ridge Homeowners Association. Not the notice I'd been asking for, a new one. It cited an outstanding fine for unpermitted structure remediation costs, billing me for the cost of the demolition itself, on top of a monthly late fee that had apparently been accruing since before the crew ever showed up. I read the number twice to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. Then I called Roger Bass again. This time he picked up. "I want to be reasonable here," he said, before I'd even finished explaining why I was calling. But the association followed its enforcement procedure. The remediation billing is standard once a violation reaches this stage. "You tore down a cabin my father built in 1978, I said. "Before your association had a name, and now you want me to pay for the crew that did it. The covenant boundary determines jurisdiction, not the construction date," he said, the same line Whitfield had used, word for word, like it had been rehearsed between them. "If you believe the parcel falls outside that boundary, you're welcome to submit a formal boundary dispute request. It's a lengthy process, but it exists." I asked him to send me the boundary dispute paperwork on the spot. He said he'd have it mailed. It took another 11 days to arrive, and when it did, the form itself required documentation I didn't yet have: a certified county survey, not a handwritten note from my father or a photocopied newsletter map. That was the moment I understood the shape of what I was up against. It wasn't going to be one confrontation and a clear answer. It was going to be paperwork built to slow me down, filed by people who already knew, or strongly suspected, that a real survey would prove them wrong, which was exactly why they needed one from me, on their terms, on their timeline, instead of digging one up themselves. I just had no idea yet how far Carol Whitfield would go to make sure I never got there. The boundary dispute form sat on my kitchen table for almost 2 weeks while I tried to figure out where to even start getting a certified survey done. Then the second letter arrived, and it made the choice for me. This one came from Roger Bass directly, on law firm letterhead, informing me that because the remediation fine remained unpaid, the association intended to file a lien against my primary residence, the house in town, not even the cabin property, under a clause he described as cross-collateralization for outstanding member obligations. I called him immediately. "My house has nothing to do with that cabin," I said. "I'm not even sure the cabin was a covered property to begin with." "The lien provision applies to any property owned by a member in good standing violation," he said. "It's standard in our governing documents." "Send me those governing documents," I said. "The actual recorded covenant, not a summary." There was a pause, just long enough to tell me he hadn't expected me to ask for that specifically. "I'll have that sent over," he said, and hung up before I could push further. 3 days later, a thick packet arrived, 40-some pages of covenant language, easily readable if you had a law degree and a free afternoon, considerably less readable if you were a guy who sold industrial equipment for a living and hadn't touched legal documents since his divorce. I sat with it anyway, a highlighter in one hand and a legal dictionary app open on my phone, and started marking anything that used the word boundary or jurisdiction. What I found wasn't reassuring, but it wasn't the airtight case Whitfield made it sound like either. The covenant defined the association's authority as applying to all parcels within the recorded plat boundary of Meadowbrook Ridge, as amended. Amended, not fixed. Which meant somewhere there should be an official record of every amendment, every time that boundary had changed, and if my father's note about a county resurvey was real, there should be a document showing the ridge line and our parcel being excluded from that boundary at some specific point. I needed to find that amendment record, and I had a strong feeling Carol Whitfield didn't want me to. Around that same time, I ran into a woman named Patricia at the gas station near the ridge. She introduced herself after noticing my truck, which apparently a few people out there had started to recognize. She said her family had gotten hit with a similar fine 2 years earlier, over a shed that predated the HOA by even more than my father's cabin did. She'd paid it rather than fight, she told me, because Bass had made it sound like resisting would cost more in legal fees than just settling. "She counts on people not wanting the headache," Patricia said. "That's the whole play. Make it sound bigger than it is, and most people fold before they check." I asked if she still had any paperwork from her case. She said she might somewhere and gave me her number. That night, the lien notice sitting on my counter next to my father's old note, I realized the fine and the threat against my house weren't really about money. They were about pressure, about making the boundary dispute cost more than it was worth to pursue, exactly the way Patricia had described. Whitfield wasn't just enforcing a covenant, she was betting that I'd fold the same way everyone else apparently had. A few days after that, I found out the pressure wasn't only coming through the mail. A guy I used to work with, whose brother lived out near the Ridge, mentioned that my name had come up at a Meadowbrook Ridge social event, not kindly. Whitfield, apparently, had described me at a board mixer as a difficult estate situation and hinted that I was trying to dodge fines legitimately owed, using my father's death as leverage for sympathy. That stung more than the lien notice had. It was one thing to fight over documents and boundary lines. It was another to have my father's memory used as a talking point to make me look like the unreasonable one. I called a lawyer, not Bass, obviously, but an actual attorney of my own, a guy named Frank Delgado, who handled property disputes out of a small office downtown. He was blunt with me from the first meeting. He said HOA boundary disputes were notoriously slow and expensive to litigate, that most homeowners settled just to avoid the legal fees, and that unless I could produce something concrete, an actual surveyed boundary, an actual amendment record, I'd be fighting an uphill argument against an organization with a standing legal budget and no urgency to resolve anything quickly. Find the paper, he told me. If your dad's note is right and there's a real resurvey on file somewhere, that changes everything. Without it, you're just a guy with a story. That was the moment the investigation stopped being something I was doing out of stubbornness and became something closer to necessity. I needed the actual county record, the amendment, the resurvey, whatever it was called officially. And I needed someone who actually knew how to find decades-old boundary paperwork in a county archive that apparently hadn't been touched in years. I thought about the woman at the recorder's office who'd told me the old resurvey records would need to be pulled in person by someone who remembered the process. And then I remembered something Ed had mentioned in passing the day the crew tore down the cabin, that there was an old clerk who used to work the county office, retired now, who knew that archive better than anyone left on staff. His name was Sam Doyle, and Ed thought he still lived somewhere near town. I drove out looking for him that same week, less because I had a plan and more because Frank Delgado's words kept repeating in my head. Find the paper. Whitfield had already shown me what she was willing to do with fines and liens and quiet rumors at social events. If she was willing to go that far to protect a boundary claim, I had a growing feeling the paper trail she was hoping I'd never find was exactly as damning as my father's 15-year-old note suggested. She'd picked the wrong year to make that bet. Sam Doyle turned out to live in a small house not far from the county line, the kind of place with a woodpile stacked too neatly to belong to anyone who didn't still think of upkeep as a form of respect. He was in his late 70s, sharp-eyed, and, once I mentioned my father's name, surprisingly willing to talk. Harold Pierce, he said, like he was turning the name over to check it against something. Built out past the old Denton fence line, didn't he? I remember that parcel. Filed under meets and bounds, not a plat lot. That always made resurveys a headache when the development went in. I told him what had happened. The demolition, the fine, the lien threat, Whitfield's insistence that the covenant applied retroactively to any parcel inside a boundary that kept getting described differently depending on who I asked. Sam listened without interrupting, then asked the one question I hadn't thought to ask myself yet. Did anybody ever show you the actual amended plat? Not a newsletter map. The recorded one with a surveyor's stamp. I said no. Nobody had shown me anything but photocopies and covenant language describing a boundary as amended with no attached amendment. Sam nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he already suspected. There was a resurvey out that way. I want to say, 9 or 2010. County had to correct some old ridgeline descriptions after a couple of parcels got disputed over water rights. Nothing to do with the HOA directly. But when they redrew it, a handful of parcels that had been sitting right on the fuzzy edge of the development boundary got formally excluded. Went through the recorder's office. I helped file some of that paperwork myself before I retired. That matched my father's note almost word for word. County resurveyed the ridgeline. Parcel confirmed outside development boundary per clerk's letter. Sam agreed to come with me to the county archive the following week, since he still had a working relationship with a couple of people on staff and knew exactly which drawer, in his words, the old stuff nobody digitized, would be sitting in. It took the better part of a full day, but we found it. An amended plat map from 2010, stamped and recorded, showing a corrected ridgeline boundary for the Meadowbrook Ridge Covenant District. My father's parcel, described the same way it had been in his original 1978 deed, sat clearly and unambiguously outside the amended line. Not close to it, not arguably on it. Outside it by a margin wide enough that nobody could call it a clerical coin flip. Attached to the recorded amendment was a letter, exactly as my father's note described, sent to affected property owners at the time, notifying them their parcels had been excluded from the development's covenant boundary going forward. My father's copy must have been the one sitting in that folder in my garage for over a decade, filed away because it never became a problem in his lifetime. Sam pulled a second document, too, one I hadn't expected. Internal HOA board meeting minutes from a few years back, obtained through a public records request he still knew how to file properly, in which a board member had raised the question of several parcels, mine included by description, potentially sitting outside the covenant boundary following the 2010 resurvey. The minutes noted the item was tabled for further review and never appeared on another agenda again. Someone on that board had known. Maybe not Whitfield specifically, not yet provably, but someone had raised exactly the issue my father's note predicted, and it had been buried instead of resolved. I sat in my truck in the county parking lot with copies of both documents on the seat beside me, and for the first time since the bulldozer showed up in my father's yard, I didn't feel like a man chasing an explanation. I felt like a man holding proof. I called Frank Delgado from the parking lot before I'd even started the truck. I read him the recording date on the amended plat, the language about the excluded parcels, and the line in the board minutes about the item being tabled and never revisited. There was a pause on his end long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Nathan," he finally said, "if that plat is what you're describing, and those minutes show the board was aware, you don't have a boundary dispute anymore. You have an association that demolished a private structure with no jurisdiction to do so, and possibly buried an internal finding that would have stopped them. That's a different conversation entirely. That's exposure for them, not just a fee for you." He told me to get certified copies of everything, not just photocopies, and to be careful who I showed the documents to before we had a plan. "People like this don't fold quietly," he said. "The second she knows what you've got, she's going to try to control how and when it comes out. You want to control that instead." I drove out to Sam's place that evening instead of going straight home. He made coffee, and we sat at his kitchen table going over the documents again, slower this time, checking every date and signature against what he remembered from his years at the recorder's office. He confirmed the surveyor's stamp was legitimate, matched a firm that had done several resurveys in the county around that time, and that the board minutes bore all the formatting marks of an authentic HOA record, rather than something assembled after the fact. "Your dad wasn't wrong about much from what I remember of him," Sam said. "Careful man, kept his paperwork the way surveyors keep theirs." I told him about Whitfield's comment at the board mixer, calling my situation a difficult estate matter, like I was the one being unreasonable. Sam just shook his head. "She's been president, 6 years now? She'd have been on the board when those minutes were written. Tabled and never revisited doesn't happen by accident on something like a boundary exclusion. Somebody decided it was easier to keep collecting dues and enforcing fines on parcels they already had reason to believe weren't theirs to enforce on." That was the part that sat heaviest with me driving home that night. This had stopped being a misunderstanding somewhere along the way, if it had ever really been one. My father's cabin hadn't been torn down because of a genuine, honest mistake about where a line on a map sat. It had been torn down by an organization that had been warned, on the record years earlier, and chosen silence over correction because silence was more profitable. I called Karen that night and read her the same line I'd read Frank from the parking lot. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing I'd been feeling but hadn't said out loud yet. "Dad would want you to make them say it in front of everybody, not just pay you back quietly and hope it goes away." She was right. Whatever settlement or apology Whitfield's people eventually offered behind closed doors wasn't going to be enough. If they'd known and buried it, the only ending that felt like it honored what my father built was one where they had to say so, publicly, with the paper in front of them and nowhere left to point the blame. The next Meadowbrook Ridge community meeting was in 11 days. I intended to be there, with Sam, with the plat, and with the minutes nobody was supposed to remember existed. The Meadowbrook Ridge community meetings were held in a clubhouse near the entrance to the development, a building with a stone fireplace nobody ever lit, and rows of folding chairs that never quite filled up. That night, they did, Word had apparently traveled that Nathan Pierce, the man whose father's cabin got torn down, was planning to show up with something. Carol Whitfield ran the meeting from a small table at the front, Roger Bass seated beside her with a leather folder he never opened. She moved through the usual business, landscaping bids, a pool maintenance schedule, with the practiced patience of someone who knew exactly what was coming and had decided the best defense was to look unbothered by it. When she finally opened the floor to resident concerns, I stood up before she'd finished the sentence. I'd like to address the demolition of my father's cabin, I said, and the boundary this board has been claiming authority over. Whitfield's expression didn't change. Mr. Pierce, we've discussed this. The covenant boundary is a matter of public record. It is, I said. That's exactly why I went and got it. I held up the certified copy of the 2010 amended plat, and Sam, sitting beside me, held up the board minutes. I read the recording date, the surveyor's stamp, the description of the excluded parcels matching my father's original deed almost word for word. A murmur went through the folding chairs behind me. This board redrew its own boundary in 2010, I said, and my father's parcel was formally excluded from it, not disputed. Excluded, on the record, by a licensed surveyor filed with the county. That means this association never had jurisdiction over that cabin, not last year, not when the notice was supposedly mailed, not on the day the crew showed up with an excavator. Whitfield reached for the microphone at her table. That's one interpretation of an old survey document, Mr. Pierce, and frankly, I'd want our attorney to review its authenticity before. There's more, I said, and nodded at Sam, who read the date and item number from the board minutes out loud. The meeting where a board member had raised the exact concern that several parcels, including mine by description, appeared to sit outside the amended boundary. The item tabled, never revisited. The room went quiet in a different way than it had a moment before. I watched a woman near the front, an older board member I didn't recognize, turn her head slowly toward Whitfield. "Carol," she said, "were you on the board when this was tabled?" Whitfield's composure cracked for the first time all night, just barely, a half-second delay before she answered. "I don't recall the specifics of every agenda item from years ago." "You've been treasurer or president every year since," the woman said. "I'd think this one would have stood out." Bass finally opened his leather folder, flipping through papers like he was looking for something to say that would end the moment, and came up with nothing better than, "The association maintains that enforcement actions were undertaken in good faith, based on the information available to the board at the time." "The information available," I repeated, "that a board member specifically raised, and that got tabled instead of resolved. That's not good faith. That's a decision to keep collecting fines on land you had reason to believe wasn't yours to fine." More murmurs. A man a few rows back, whom I didn't know, said loud enough for the room to hear, "Is that why my shed got cited 2 years ago? Same excuse, boundary language, no actual survey shown?" Yo. Patricia, the woman I'd met at the gas station, stood up from somewhere near the back. "I paid a fine over this exact kind of thing. Nobody ever showed me a real survey either. I paid because Roger made it sound like fighting it would cost more." Whitfield tried once more to steer the room back toward procedure, saying the board would take the documents under advisement and address it at a future session, in the appropriate format, through the appropriate channel. But the room wasn't having the delay anymore. Questions kept coming, not just about my father's cabin now, but about Patricia's fine, the man's shed, and at least 2 other residents who spoke up about notices they'd received that never came with an actual boundary document attached. The meeting ended without a resolution, technically. Whitfield gavelled it closed a few minutes early, citing the late hour, and left through the side door with Bass close behind her, neither making eye contact with the room on the way out. Out in the parking lot afterward, the older board member who'd asked Whitfield the pointed question caught up with me before I reached my truck. She introduced herself as Rosalind Farrer, said she'd joined the board 2 years ago, mostly to keep an eye on the landscaping budget, and hadn't had any idea the boundary issue went back as far as it apparently did. "I want copies of what you showed tonight," she said. "Officially through the right channel, so nobody can say it was hearsay. If that item really was tabled and buried, that's not just a Nathan Pierce problem. That's a board integrity problem, and I intend to raise it." I told her I'd have Frank Delgado send her certified copies directly, so there'd be no question about the chain of custody. She thanked me, then hesitated before adding one more thing. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about your father's cabin. Whatever comes out of this, that part can't be undone. but it sounds like he kept better records than half this board did. Patricia found me a few minutes later, said she wanted to talk to Frank too about the fine she'd paid, in case there was any chance of getting it back now that the pattern was starting to look less like a coincidence and more like a policy. I gave her Frank's number and told her he'd probably want to talk to the man with the shed as well, and anyone else in the room who'd mentioned a similar notice. Driving home, Sam riding shotgun with the folder of documents between us, neither of us said much for the first few miles. It was Sam who finally broke the silence. "You did more in there tonight than most people manage in a case like this," he said. "But she's not going to just let this die at a community meeting. Whitfield strikes me as someone who's built her whole standing in that neighborhood on being the person who runs things. She's going to look for a way to control the story before it gets told for her." I asked him what that might look like. He shrugged. "Could be she tries to get ahead of it with the county herself, spin it as a clerical mix-up nobody's fault. Could be Bass tries to quietly settle with you before this goes any further public, hoping a private payout keeps it out of any real record. Either way, I wouldn't expect her to just accept that room turning on her tonight as the end of it." He was right, as it turned out, though not quite in the way either of us guessed. 2 days later, Frank Delgado called to tell me Roger Bass had reached out directly to his office, not with a settlement offer, but with a request for a private meeting between Whitfield, Bass, and me. Informal, he called it, to resolve this amicably before things escalate further. Frank's read was blunt. They wanted one more shot at making this go away quietly before Rosalind Farrer's official records request forced the board minutes into the light, where nobody could pretend they'd been misplaced. I told Frank to set the meeting, not because I planned on settling quietly. I wanted to hear, face to face, exactly how far Carol Whitfield was willing to bend the truth when she thought she still had one more card left to play. And I wanted her to know, before that meeting ever started, that I already knew she didn't. Before the private meeting Bass had requested ever happened, I made one more call, not to Frank, not to Sam, but to the county zoning office itself. If Whitfield wanted to sit across a table from me and offer some version of an amicable resolution, I wanted her doing it already knowing the county had the same documents Sam and I had pulled, verified independently, on the record, where no board vote could bury them a second time. The zoning office agreed to an informal review hearing once Frank submitted the certified plat and the board minutes along with a formal complaint outlining the demolition. They brought in a licensed county surveyor, a methodical man named Everett Kaminsky, to verify the amended boundary against current GIS mapping before anyone even discussed enforcement authority. The hearing was smaller than the community meeting had been, held in a plain county conference room instead of a clubhouse with a fireplace nobody lit. But it mattered more because everyone in that room had the authority to make a finding that would matter legally, not just socially. Kaminsky laid the amended 2010 plat next to a current parcel map on a projector screen, tracing the corrected ridgeline with a laser pointer. "The parcel in question," he said, "described here by the same meets and bounds language recorded in the original 1978 deed, falls approximately 420 feet outside the amended Meadowbrook Ridge Covenant boundary. This isn't a marginal case. It's not close enough to argue interpretation. The parcel was formally, deliberately excluded from the district in 2010 and has remained outside it in every recorded map since." Whitfield, seated across the table with Bass beside her, tried the same language she'd used from the beginning. "The association's internal records have consistently shown this parcel within our enforcement boundary," she said. "If there's a discrepancy between internal HOA mapping and the county's amended plat, that's an administrative matter that predates my time as president." "It doesn't, though," I said, and nodded at Frank, who slid a copy of the board minutes across the table toward the county official presiding over the hearing. "This is from a board meeting during your presidency, Ms. Whitfield. A board member raised this exact discrepancy. It was tabled. It was never brought back. That's not an administrative gap. That's a decision." The county official, a woman named Diane Okafor, who I later learned handled zoning enforcement disputes across half the county, read the minutes silently, then looked up at Whitfield directly. "Ms. Whitfield, were you present for this meeting?" Whitfield's answer came slower than any answer she'd given all day. "I believe I was, yes." "And you understood at that time that this concern had been raised regarding this parcel and others?" "It was one item among many that year," Whitfield said. "It wasn't flagged as urgent." "A parcel potentially outside your enforcement authority isn't urgent?" Okafor asked, and for the first time since I'd met her, Carol Whitfield didn't have a smooth answer ready. Bass tried to step in, framing it as a matter of reasonable board discretion and resource prioritization, but Okafor cut through it plainly. Mr. Bass, I understand your role here, but discretion doesn't extend to demolishing a private structure on a parcel the board had documented reason to believe fell outside its jurisdiction. That's not a gray area. That's an association acting without authority, on notice that it may not have had that authority, and proceeding anyway. Kaminsky added his own finding for the record, that based on the amended plat, current GIS data, and the original deed description, the parcel had never been validly part of the Meadowbrook Ridge Covenant District since the 2010 correction, meaning any HOA enforcement action taken against it, including the code violation notice and subsequent demolition, had been conducted with no legal jurisdiction whatsoever. I watched something happen to Whitfield's face in that moment that I hadn't seen in any of our previous encounters. Not composure cracking slightly, but composure gone entirely. For the first time, she wasn't managing the room. She was just a person hearing, out loud, in an official record, that everything she'd built her authority on for years had a hole in it she'd known about and chosen to ignore. I'd like to note for the record, Frank said, that beyond the wrongful demolition itself, my client was subsequently billed for remediation costs and threatened with a lien on an unrelated property based on the same invalid jurisdiction claim. We intend to pursue restitution for the value of the structure, associated damages, and a formal correction of the association's enforcement boundary to prevent this from happening to any other resident. Okafor made a note, then addressed the room. This office will be issuing a formal finding that the demolished structure fell outside the association's jurisdiction as of the 2010 boundary amendment. I'll also be referring the tabled board minutes to County Council for review, given the apparent knowledge and inaction described. Ms. Whitfield, Mr. Bass, I'd strongly recommend the association begin cooperating fully with restitution discussions rather than contesting a finding this well documented. Whitfield didn't argue further. She sat very still, staring at the projected map with the corrected ridgeline running clearly, undeniably, outside the boundary of everything she'd claimed to have authority over. Afterward, in the hallway, Bass approached Frank quietly to discuss settlement terms, his earlier confidence replaced with the careful, deflated tone of a man calculating how much this was about to cost the people he represented. Whitfield said nothing to me at all. She walked past without a word, and for the first time since a bulldozer showed up in my father's yard, that silence didn't feel like control. The amicable resolution meeting Bass had originally requested still happened, 3 days after the county hearing, though by then it wasn't the meeting he'd planned for. It took place in Frank Delgado's office instead of some neutral coffee shop Bass had first proposed, with a court reporter present at Frank's insistence, so nothing said in that room could later be described as informal or off the record. Whitfield opened by trying a version of the same tone she'd used the very first day, standing in my father's driveway. Reasonable, measured. A woman simply enforcing rules she hadn't personally written. I want to be clear that the association never acted in bad faith, she said. Boundary corrections happen. Paperwork gets lost. I don't think anyone on that board intended for a demolition to happen on a parcel that turned out to be outside our jurisdiction. The minutes say otherwise, Frank said, sliding the same document across the table that had already done its damage once. This isn't paperwork getting lost, Ms. Whitfield. This is a documented concern, raised by name, tabled by the board you were sitting on, and never revisited for years, while fines continued to accrue on this parcel and at least 2 others we now know of. Bass tried to redirect toward numbers instead of blame, proposing a settlement figure for the value of the cabin that Frank and I both recognized immediately as low, calculated more around what it would take to keep this quiet than what the structure and the years of stress were actually worth. I let Frank handle the back and forth on figures because that was his job, but I watched Whitfield's face while the negotiating happened, and I saw something in it that told me everything I still needed to know. She wasn't sorry the cabin was gone. She was sorry it had cost her the room. When the settlement conversation stalled on figures, Frank laid out plainly what would happen if it didn't resolve there. A public restitution claim, filed alongside the county's own referral to council regarding the board minutes, meaning the story wouldn't stay contained to a private room, no matter how this particular meeting ended. Whitfield's attorney recalculated visibly, and within another hour the number on the table had more than tripled, alongside an agreement to formally correct the association's mapped boundary and issue written notice to every resident whose parcel had been affected by the same outdated line. It wasn't the moment I'd imagined, back in that driveway watching the excavator finish its work. There was no dramatic gavel, no single sentence that undid what had happened to my father's cabin. But it was the moment the fight stopped being mine to carry alone, and started being something the record itself would carry forward. A documented, county-referred, publicly known finding that Meadowbrook Ridge Homeowners Association had torn down a private structure on land it knew, or should have known, it had no authority over. Rosalind Ferrer's official records request went through a week later anyway, regardless of the settlement, and the board minutes became part of the association's public file, exactly as she'd promised. 2 more residents, beyond Patricia and the man with the shed, came forward once the finding became public, describing fines and notices that had used the same boundary language on parcels that turned out to sit outside the corrected line as well. By the time it was over, Carol Whitfield wasn't the woman running the room anymore. She was the name attached to the finding everyone in Meadowbrook Ridge was now asking questions about. It felt like someone finally running out of paper to hide behind. The settlement money came through about 6 weeks after that meeting in Frank's office, along with a formal letter from the association acknowledging the boundary error and confirming the corrected map had been recorded and distributed to all affected residents. It wasn't the kind of letter that used the word apology, but between the finding, the county referral, and the number attached to the settlement, it didn't need to. I used part of the money to hire a contractor Sam recommended, an older builder who'd worked with his hands his whole life, the same way my father had, and told him I didn't want a replica of the old cabin. I wanted something smaller, simpler, built on the same footprint, using as much of the salvageable lumber as we could pull from what the crew had left scattered across the yard. Some of it was too damaged to use. Some of it wasn't. We framed the new structure that fall. I kept one of the porch rails from the original, sanded smooth by my father's hands 30 years earlier, and had the builder work it into the new front steps instead of replacing it. It didn't match the new wood perfectly. I didn't want it to. Carol Whitfield resigned from the board about 2 months after the settlement, before the county's referral to council had even concluded. The official notice framed it as a personal decision, unrelated to any pending matters, the same kind of smooth, unbothered language she used to hand me in that driveway. Nobody at Meadowbrook Ridge seemed to believe it, and from what Rosalind told me later, the board that replaced her spent its first several meetings almost entirely on reviewing every enforcement action taken over the previous decade, checking each one against the corrected boundary line. 2 other residents beyond Patricia and the man with the shed ended up filing their own restitution claims once the finding became public record. And from what Frank heard through the county office, at least 1 more case was still being reviewed months later, involving a family who'd paid a fine years earlier without ever questioning whether their land had truly been inside the district to begin with. Patricia called me once her own claim resolved, mostly just to say thank you, though I told her the thanks belonged more to Sam, who'd known exactly where to look, and to my father, who'd kept a scrap of paper for 15 years that turned out to matter more than anything I found on my own. Karen came out to see the new structure once the framing was far enough along to make sense of, and she stood on the new porch steps, running her hand along that one salvaged rail the same way I had, the same way our father used to before either of us really understood why he cared so much about a piece of wood he'd sanded smooth himself. He'd have liked that you didn't just let them win by paying you off quietly, she said. He'd have wanted them to say it out loud, in front of everybody, the way you made them. I told her that was exactly what I'd wanted too, from the moment I stood in that driveway reading a violation notice for a boundary that was never really theirs to enforce. Sam still comes out to the property sometimes, mostly to check on how the new build is coming along, though I suspect partly because he likes seeing a piece of paperwork he helped file decades ago finally do the job it was always supposed to do. Ed still lives up past the tree line, and he's the one who told me, a few months after everything settled, that the new HOA board had sent a formal notice to every resident clarifying the corrected covenant boundary and promising an independent review of any future enforcement action before fines or demolitions could proceed. Frank Delgado told me later that our case had already come up informally in a couple of conversations with other property attorneys in the county, mostly as a cautionary example for HOA boards about the risk of tabling a known boundary discrepancy instead of resolving it. He didn't think it would change much on a broad scale. Associations like Meadowbrook Ridge existed all over, run by people who liked the authority more than they respected its limits, but he said it had at least made a few boards in the area nervous enough to quietly review their own old resurvey records, just in case. Rosalind stayed on the new board through that whole review process, and she called me once, near the end of it, to let me know they'd found two more parcels with the exact same kind of outdated boundary error, both belonging to older residents who'd never questioned a fine they'd paid years earlier. She said the new board planned to reach out directly rather than waiting for someone to fight their way to the answer the way I'd had to. It shouldn't take a demolished cabin and a lawyer to get an HOA to check its own map, she said, but I suppose sometimes that's what it takes. I didn't disagree with her. I'd spent months learning that lesson from the wrong direction, starting with a bulldozer in my father's yard and ending with a projector screen in a county conference room showing a boundary line that had been sitting there, correct and recorded, the entire time. Nobody had needed to invent anything to win this. The truth had been filed away in a drawer for over a decade, waiting on someone stubborn enough or attached enough to go looking for it. By the time the new structure was finished, late that winter, it didn't look much like my father's original cabin from the outside. Smaller roofline, different siding, a layout the contractor and I worked out together instead of the one Dad drew up on his own decades earlier. But standing inside it the first cold evening I spent there, with the porch rail he'd sanded smooth still holding up the front steps exactly where it always had, it felt like the same place. Not because the wood matched, because the reason it existed hadn't changed at all. I never did get a personal apology out of Carol Whitfield, not one word of it, not even after her resignation went through and the new board took over reviewing every enforcement action she'd ever signed off on. I used to think I needed that from her directly, standing in front of me the way she'd stood in that driveway the first morning, calm and certain of a ground that was never really hers to stand on. I don't think that anymore. What I got instead was better, in its own way, than an apology would have been. I got a recorded county finding nobody could argue with. I got a board minutes document, buried once, dragged back into daylight, that couldn't be tabled a second time. I got a corrected boundary map distributed to every resident who'd ever been fined, off the strength of a line that was never actually there. An apology is just words. This was proof, filed permanently where nobody gets to bury it again. Some nights, sitting on that new porch with the one salvaged rail under my hand, I still think about the version of this where I let it go, where I paid the remediation fine, let the lien threat scare me into settling quiet and fast, and never drove out to find Sam Doyle or asked Frank Delgado what a board's silence on a known problem actually meant. It would have been easier in the short version of things. Whitfield was counting on easier. But my father spent 15 years holding onto a scrap of paper he probably assumed he'd never need, just in case somebody ever tried to tell him his land belonged to a line it never crossed. I think he'd have wanted me to finish what that note started, whatever it cost, however long it took. I like to think that somewhere in all of this, he'd have recognized exactly what I was doing and why. I think about that first morning a lot, standing in the dust, holding a violation notice that turned out to be worth nothing at all, wondering how an organization gets to decide it has authority just by saying so loudly enough and often enough that people stop asking for proof. I don't think Carol Whitfield believed, deep down, that she had a real claim to that boundary. I think she believed that most people wouldn't push hard enough to find out either way. That's what Patricia told me the very first week I started asking questions, standing next to her car at a gas station, and it turned out to be the truest thing anyone said to me through the whole ordeal. Make it sound bigger than it is, and most people fold before they check. I didn't fold, but I'll admit it wasn't out of some grand principle I walked into this with. It was because my father built that cabin with his own hands, kept a note about a resurvey for 15 years just in case it ever mattered, and I owed it to him to at least go check before I let anyone tell me his land belonged to a boundary he never signed on to. That's the part I keep coming back to. The proof was always there. It just took someone willing to go find it instead of assuming the people in charge already had. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to take with them, it's that authority isn't the same thing as being right. An HOA, a board, a title on a business card, none of that means jurisdiction or truth unless somebody's actually checked the map. Ask for the recorded document. Ask for the amendment. Ask who tabled the concern and why it never came back. The paper is usually still out there, sitting in a drawer somewhere, waiting on someone stubborn enough to go looking. My father's cabin is gone, the original one, the one he built board by board on land nobody had any real claim to but him. I can't get that back, and I've stopped pretending the new structure replaces it. What I got instead was something my father would have understood better than most people I know. The truth, recorded, on the record, with nobody left to pretend otherwise. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that claimed more authority than it actually had, or fought a boundary dispute that turned out to be built on paperwork nobody bothered to check, I want to hear about it. Tell me what happened in the comments, how you found out, what it cost you, whether you got your answer in the end. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe for more, because Meadowbrook Ridge wasn't the only place where somebody built their whole authority on a map nobody had the nerve to actually look at. Thanks for listening to my father's story, and mine. It's not over for a lot of people out there still fighting the same fight I did. I hope this one at least tells you where to start looking.